Hey everyone, this is Sarah with sewingpartsonline.com, and this is episode 3 of our Beginner's Guide to Sewing. Today we're just going to go over a little introduction to patterns, as well as the notions you'll be using, and a little bit about the fabric you'll be using. Patterns come in a variety of different types. The most common type are traditional tissue paper and PDFs. There are fashion patterns, home deck patterns, toy patterns, or even patterns for quilts and crafts. It all seems very intimidating now, but over time you'll pick things up here and there and you'll find the type that suits you best. Now, you don't have to use patterns to sew. In fact, there are tons of tutorials online, many of our own, that don't use any patterns, just simple measurements. However, a basic knowledge of patterns, fabric, and notions is important before heading to the sewing machine. Think of a pattern like your recipe card. For the most part, it tells you a list of supplies as well as step-by-step instructions. The trick is knowing how to read it. After all, these things can look pretty overwhelming at first. The front of your pattern will have images and/or drawings of the finished project. As a beginner, look for that easy to sew label or something along those lines. As cliche as it sounds, skirts, pajamas, pillows, and blankets really are the best projects to learn on. Patterns these days come in multiple sizes, as you'll see here. On the back, you'll see measurements and the corresponding sizes. It's crucial that you use the measurements listed on the back, as ready-made clothing sizes are often different. As a beginner, you'll most likely be working with hip, bust, waist, and inseam measurements. But as you can see, all the needed measurements are listed, as well as a link to follow for detailed instructions on how to record these measurements. Each pattern has its own list of suitable fabric types as well as the notions required. Make sure you buy all the notions and the correct amount of fabric, plus a little extra to account for mistakes. But we'll go more over fabric and notions in a minute, but first let's just learn the basics of our pattern. This little rectangle up here is just to make sure that your knitted fabric has the required amount of give or stretch for the project you're doing. One more thing to note is the pattern number, listed right here. When you search through pattern catalogs, you'll see the patterns are sorted and filed by this item number. Each package has a little instruction manual inside. Familiarize yourself with these instructions. If after reading and rereading you are still completely confused, don't worry, it's completely normal. I don't think anyone fully understands these massive commercially made patterns. Half the time it's mostly just a guessing game. So with that being said, buying patterns from private small design companies and bloggers like C. Kate Sew, 5 and 10 Designs, and Pattern Anthology is super helpful because their instructions are more intuitive and easy to understand. Plus, if you need any help, the designers are only an email away. It's important to follow the fabric layout grid because they help prevent mistakes. Sometimes you may feel like you're wasting fabric, but the layout helps ensure patterns are cut along the correct nap, ease, and grain, which I'll explain more in detail when we go over fabric. When you unfold the pattern, make sure to iron out all the creases without steam. You'll see a ton of lines, shapes, numbers, arrows, a whole mess of confusion. Oh, and just so you know, the likelihood of getting your pattern piece to fold back up as it came is slim to none. I usually just shove mine in a Ziploc bag when I'm all finished. So let's go over the basic symbols. The dashed lines are the different sized patterns. So if I wanted to sew a size 1 pattern, I would cut along the 1 line. If I wanted to sew a size 2, I'd cut along the size 2 marking. This is a grain line. It's basically telling you how to line up the weave of your fabric, but we'll get more into that in a minute. These are darts. They basically help the pattern form to your body, just as you would see with a fitted blouse. This is a fold line. It literally just means that you're going to place this line up against the folded edge of the fabric. Whenever you need to make tailoring adjustments to a project, say you need to make pants shorter or longer, do it along the lengthen or shorten lines as to not mess up the design of the project. Notches act as matching points and start-stop sewing points. There are also points for notions, buttonholes, zippers, elastic, all that fun stuff. But we'll get more into that later too. Just know that that's what this is. Pay attention to your pattern pieces because they tell you how much of each pattern you need to cut out and whether you'll need the cutout piece to be from stabilizer or lining or interfacing. For the sake of simplicity, I like to group fabric into two categories, stretchy and non-stretchy, aka woven. It all depends on how the fibers are interlocked. Are they knitted together, which allows the fabric to stretch, or are they woven together, which prevents stretching, unless of course you pull along the bias, but we'll get there in a minute. You could create a whole series based on the different types of fabric, but essentially there are either natural fibers or there are man-made fibers or there's a combination of both. Each have their own benefits and drawbacks. The type of fabric as well as the care instructions and composition are listed on the bolt. It's helpful to take a picture with your phone when you buy the fabric so you don't forget. Rule of thumb: if you ever plan to wash your finished project, you need to pre-wash your fabric before you start doing anything. It's just one of those facts of life. If you don't, you risk a warped, shrunken mess after your first wash. The grain refers to the perpendicular lines that are interlocked to form fabric. When woven fabric is pulled on the grain, it should not stretch. When pulled on the bias, aka diagonally, you'll see a bit of ease. Along the length of the fabric edges are the selvage. These are factory finished edges. When you bring the fabric home, it will likely be off grain. So snip about 2 inches into the selvage on both ends and rip. This will instantly straighten your fabric and put it on grain. For super delicate fabric or something you don't necessarily want to rip, pull out a single thread fiber along the entire length of the fabric. You'll notice a void in the weave. Cut along this void with your fabric scissors. Now your fabric is on grain. For quilters, you want to do what's called squaring up your fabric. So fold the fabric so you get rid of that weird, awkward lump, and then with your rotary mat and rotary cutter, even out the edges. The whole point of squaring up and putting the fabric on the grain is to ensure that your pattern pieces are truly cut along the grain or bias or whatever it is that your pattern calls for. Now let's get back to the nap. When we talk about nap, we are referring to the directionality of plush and printed fabric. For instance, you can see a stark difference in the appearance of this faux fur as I go against the nap. Now, let's say I wanted to make some sweet fur pants. If the right pant leg was cut along the nap, but the left pant leg was cut against the nap, it would look awful. That and the fact that I'm wearing fur pants. The concept most often applies to prints, corduroy, velvet, fur, anything with a plush or one direction print. Now let's go over which notion is which. We're just going to go over the basics as to not add too much confusion to the mix right now. So if your pattern uses elastic, pay special attention to the type of elastic it calls for and the width. Elastic comes in a variety of types and widths. Luckily, your fabric store will have them labeled, so finding the proper type is relatively easy. Same goes for buttons. Pay special attention to what it calls for. There are a huge variety to choose from. Clasps are different than buttons. Some are hook and eye, while others are magnetic, lobster claws, snap-on. Again, I don't want to overwhelm you with the huge variety, but just know there's a difference between a clasp, most commonly a hook and eye, and a button. The two big zippers you'll find are the standard exposed zipper and an invisible zipper, as well as closed zippers and separating, which completely open up kind of like a sports jacket. Bias tape is much like binding tape, only it has a little bit of ease and is great for going around corners. Binding tape you'll find very common in quilting and home deck projects. You can make your own, but they do come in a variety of ready-made binding tape. Satin trim, you see these all the time in baby blankets, but it's also like a pre-made binding. It's just made out of satin material. There's a huge range of trim available, from decorative to utility. You can get them as cording or as piping. You can just get the filling. Just know that it plays a huge decorative role and sometimes a structural role. Now you'll see the word interfacing and stabilizer thrown around often interchangeably, but the big difference between the two is that interfacing acts to give body to the fabric. So like you'll see in collars and cuffs, it gives flexibility and body at the same time. While stabilizer is very stiff it gives structure, and it holds seams and stitches in place. Often you'll see this in purses and embroidery projects. So this was kind of just the basics, and if you feel like it's way too much information, don't worry, you'll really absorb all of this as you really continue your sewing journey. It's a lifelong learning experience and it's very exciting. Next week's video, we will be actually at the sewing machine learning how to form your first seam. In the meantime, be sure to check us out on our website at sewingpartsonline.com, on Facebook at facebook.com/sewingpartsonline, on Twitter at sewingparts, on Pinterest, Google+, Instagram, we're everywhere, and be sure to subscribe by hitting that button below for more sewing videos.